Next, we're going to go to Max Lugavere.
Lugavere, yes.
Lugavere, okay, sorry. Is a leading health and wellness advocate, filmmaker, and New York Times bestselling author of Genius Foods. His work focuses on the link between diet, lifestyle, and brain health, and he has become a trusted voice in educating people about how nutrition impacts cognitive function. Max.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Johnson, thank you for having me here today to speak on one of the most pressing public health issues of our time, nutrition. Our food environment is killing us, and it's doing so slowly over the course of decades. And if we don't change course, future generations will suffer even more. Today, 73% of the modern supermarket is made up of ultra-processed foods, foods that barely resemble what we've evolved to eat. 60% of the calories Americans consume are from these types of products. Certain demographics are hit harder than others. For example, Black Americans consume, on average, 80% of their calories from ultra-processed foods, contributing to a disproportionate burden of diet-related diseases. This isn't by accident. Many such populations are specifically targeted by advertisers. But make no mistake, all Americans are under attack, and it's costing us dearly. A recent umbrella review of meta-analyses linked ultra-processed foods to 32 negative health outcomes. Everything from cancer, heart disease, and diabetes, the usual suspects, to depression and anxiety, as Dr. Palmer has alluded to. Not one single positive health outcome was associated with these foods, not one. Ultra-processed foods, the kinds of foods that typically line our supermarket aisles, are engineered to be hyper-palatable and addictive. In fact, according to a study published by Gerhard et al. In 2022, ultra-processed foods meet the exact same criteria for addictive substances as tobacco products. Seminal NIH-funded research clearly shows their obesogenic effect. They drive us to overeat by as much as 800 calories per day, simply due to the quality of the food. This finding was actually precisely replicated and published last week in Japan. This is why America is facing an obesity epidemic. That's not about willpower. It's about the food system. And yet, the most recent Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee appeared to bury their head in the sand, claiming that there is limited evidence that ultra-processed food intake increases risk for obesity in adults. We now know that every 10% increase in the proportion of ultra-processed foods in the diet is associated with a 14% increased risk of all-cause death and a 25% higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, a cause that's near and dear to my heart, as my own mother suffered from dementia for years before passing due to pancreatic cancer. I've seen profound sickness up close and personal, and it's motivated me to dedicate my life to this fight. But ultra-processed foods aren't just driving weight gain and subsequent metabolic dysfunction. Ultra-processed foods are exposing us to dangers that are invisible to the naked eye. Forever chemicals, pesticide residues, and endocrine disruptors. You won't find microplastics on the ingredients list of any item in your cupboard, but they're there too, harming everything from our fertility to our cardiovascular health, and increasing risk of heart attack, stroke, and death, new research published in the New England Journal of Medicine has shown. Our bodies are capable and resilient, but today, the toxic burden is simply too high. These compounds are laced into the very food-like products that line our grocery store shelves, and yet they remain under-discussed in public health conversations. In fact, legitimately concerned families are gaslit again and again, reminded that, quote, everything is a chemical. It's insulting to American families like mine who have seen real sickness. All this adds up to the fact that today we are not simply living longer, we are dying longer. Chronic diseases are becoming more prevalent, and we're living out our final decades plagued by illnesses that are largely preventable with the right interventions. But here's the problem. A fraction of the money spent on chronic disease goes towards the research and promotion of these interventions. For brain disease specifically, my passion, Prevention accounts for only 2 cents of every research dollar spent. Think about that for a moment. The majority of our resources are being funneled into treatment while we're barely investing in stopping these diseases before they start. It's a short-sighted approach to one of the greatest public health challenges of our time. Prevention isn't just an option, it's the only solution. In what seems like a coordinated effort between the food industry and the upper echelons of academia and nutrition science, the dangers of ultra-processed foods continue to be suppressed, while the fear-mongering of nutrient-dense whole foods, such as red meat and eggs, continues. Even Harvard recently published a study correlating red meat consumption to type 2 diabetes. No legitimate researcher believes that unprocessed red meat consumption, which has declined over past decades while type 2 diabetes rates soar, is causally related to type 2 diabetes. This misinformation campaign is one of the greatest public health scandals of our time. If we don't change the narrative, we're going to continue to see an escalation in chronic diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and metabolic disorders that are crippling our healthcare system. We need to shift the paradigm from treatment to prevention. That means educating the public on the dangers of ultra-processed foods, incentivizing the production and consumption of whole, minimally processed foods of both plant and animal origin, and putting pressure on the food industry to improve or remove these toxic products from our shelves. And let's invest in the promotion of evidence-based diet and lifestyle interventions for chronic diseases because, as we've learned, genetics play only a small role. What we eat matters. If we act now, we can avert the collapse of our healthcare system under the weight of preventable diseases. But if we continue down this path, the cost will be staggering. And not just in terms of dollars, but in human lives. The food we eat is either the safest form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. I'll end with a question. If your grocery store has a health food section, what does that make the rest of the store? Thank you.
Good question, Max. So I also had a sneak peek at a new documentary by Asim Malhotra called First Do No Farm. We're going to actually be showing that in Wednesday night at the Capitol Center. But in there, they talked about a NOVA scale. Are you aware of this?
Yeah,
so
devised in
Nova 1,
Latin
2,
America.
3,
Yes.
where NOVA 1 was an apple, NOVA 2 was apple slices, NOVA 3 is applesauce, and then NOVA 4 is a McDonald's pie.
Ultra-processed food.
Does that kind of scale, do you think that's helpful? Is that pretty valid? I mean, what's your opinion, or how best to? I mean, you talk about ultra-processed food. I mean, what's the best way for consumers to really evaluate this? I mean, we've gone to organic, by the way, because of Dr. Casey, and you find all these organic foods, but they all have then seed oils.
Yeah.
So I mean, kind of tell us a little bit. How does the consumer navigate this?
Well, the lines are fairly blurry, you're right, and processing is a continuum, and there's nothing inherently wrong with processing a food. When you slice an apple, as you alluded to, you're processing that apple to some degree. Ultra-processed foods are defined essentially as a food that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen if you tried. It's a food product with innumerable ingredients, which doesn't necessarily demonize a food, but it's a fairly good surrogate indicator for what a processed food might look like, a food that has innumerable ingredients, half of which you can't identify or even pronounce. So I think that's a fairly good litmus test. But it's also important to understand that even within the bucket of ultra-processed foods, some are better than others, and we need to continue to do research to understand which are the most nefarious from a health standpoint. I think it's fairly well agreed, well established at this point, that sugar-sweetened beverages are among the worst offenders. They provide no satiety benefit, pure calories, artificial colorants, and the like, and there are certainly some ultra-processed foods that are likely more benign. But in general, as a general screening tool, if you will, an ultra-processed food is generally a food that you couldn't possibly replicate in your own kitchen if you tried.
I've also heard just comments like, don't drink your sugar, eat what your grandparents ate. You're pretty solid ground from that standpoint. So,
Senator, I just wanted to quickly mention, working for the food companies, in the past 2 years, there's been 50,000 nutrition studies created. And I can tell you, nutrition research is ultra-processed food marketing documentation. You know, there's not a big lobby for the broccoli or regenerative beef. And I think we've been divorced from our common sense of these questions. We are the only animals that have chronic rates of obesity and metabolic dysfunction. We're born with an innate sense with whole food of what to eat. You can't overeat broccoli or steak. And I think the key thing with these, you know, I think the industry wants us to get into a debate about which ingredient's good, which ingredient's bad. These science experiments are designed to hijack our evolutionary biology. And I think we could replace all nutrition guidance with, you know, a deprioritization of ultra-processed food and be in a much, much better place. I would truly recommend firing almost every single nutrition advisor in the U.S. government and replacing it with very simple guidelines.
I would say it depends on how good the steak is.
For people who might be looking at this hearing and who
Best to steer. It's best to shop around the perimeter of the supermarket. Most people don't realize this, but supermarkets are designed the same way. It's the aisles that contain all the ultra-processed foods typically. It's not to say that there's not good stuff in those aisles. Extra virgin olive oil, nut seeds, things like that. But the more you can keep your shopping cart tethered to the perimeter of the supermarket, the better off you'll be.
You know, I really do want to discuss, when we get down to the presentations, you know, how can consumers contend with this? You know, we don't all live in California where they have farmers markets all the time. You know, and again, my belief, my hope is that consumer demand will drive greater availability. But let's move through there. But I really want to discuss that because that's people want to know how can I live this way? How can I live healthier? How can I obtain these things?